Hello and welcome to Pennsylvania Crossfire. I'm Buddy Lesevoy, a local attorney, and I'll be your moderator today. Pennsylvania Crossfire is brought to you by this station and our sponsors to air important issues of the day. Today we've got a fantastic lineup for us. We've got on the left Dr. Stephen Hunt. He's a MD, PhD, an interventional radiologist and basic science researcher at the University of Pennsylvania with an interest in economics and politics. On the right we've got Dr. Nirav Mehta. He's an MD with an MS degree. He's a radiologist at Mainline Health with an interest in economics and healthcare management. And finally, we have back with us again Dr. Saurabh Jha, better known as Harry. He's an MD with an MS degree, also a radiologist at the University of Pennsylvania and interested in economics, policy, and value. Today, we want to discuss the Hobby Lobby verdict. And Harry, I'd like to start with you, please, if you would, for our audience and all of our sakes, set the stage.
Thank you, Buddy. I suppose one of the interesting things about this case, being a foreigner, still a foreigner here in the United States, two interesting things. Firstly is the erudition of the Supreme Court. When you look at what they write, it's just fantastic reasoning, whether it is the dissent or the agreement. The second thing is the polarization of the country. And I'm a man of science, so I have a certain bias in this whole thing, and I'm not going to necessarily express my bias, but when you have a 5-4 Supreme Court decision on a matter that is extremely polarizing, one of the things you have to ask yourself is why? And before I get to why, let's just go back and see how. So how it all started was when the Affordable Care Act came out. There were essential medical benefits, and the reason you had essential medical benefits was that you didn't want insurers to start, turning away, sick people or people that needed medical services. And then there was also a sense of essential medical benefits that constituted good health and preventive services, for which there ought to be no co-payment. And so contraception and birth control, including the morning after pill and IUD, came under the latter umbrella, which was the good wellness and preventive services. And it was not directed by Washington. That needs to be emphasized. It came from the Institute of Medicine, and they're not necessarily comprised of politicians, bureaucrats, but just physicians and a bunch of people with different interests. And so when you had that, there was, of course, the opposition from religious people, non-profits that were religious, and certain exemptions were made, notably to non-profit organizations that had religious, that would further religious advancement. And the exemption was not made to for-profit businesses whose owners had religious beliefs. And Hobby Lobby was one of them, and this was Burwell versus Hobby Lobby. Not for contraception. The case was about the morning after pill and an IUD, because the owners of Hobby Lobby, devout Christians, believed that whilst they were happy for contraception of all forms, they weren't happy to have benefits or to have to pay for morning after pill, because they believed that birth started at conception. So it came to the Supreme Court, a narrow decision, but the upshot of it was this. There was a Restoration of Religious Freedom Act passed in 1993 during the Clinton tenure, and that act said that the government cannot impose upon somebody's religious sensibilities, and one of the things was that so long as they have other alternative means. And what the majority opinion was that whilst provision of contraception and all forms of contraception, including the morning after pill, was an area of need and was definitely something that the government had pressing concerns about access, there were alternative methods of that provision, meaning the government could actually provide that by other means rather than forcing upon the religious sensibilities of owners. But the crucial thing was that Hobby Lobby was not considered a amorphous corporation, but rather an organization by closely knit, held family could actually function under the same umbrella of that Religious Freedom Act. And so that's where those are the three components of the decision. Now, I would say that this was actually a false war between science and religion. Because if we step back a bit, regardless of where one's position, the question to ask is, why did they end up fighting in the first place? Why did this arise? And this arose because of a very, very unique thing in American healthcare of the employers being responsible for provision of insurance for their employees.
So, first of all, fantastic summary and well presented, and so, given your perspective that this is not so much a clash between science and religion, Dr. Mehta, I understand that you're an opponent of the employer-sponsored insurance, and why don't you explain why? Well,
but I think one of the reasons why we got into our current mess is because we link employment with healthcare in this country. And if you decouple the two, you wouldn't have any of these issues of trouncing on an employer's religious freedoms versus an employee's healthcare rights. All of these issues would go by the wayside, and everyone's free to choose whatever health insurance policy they want. And the question for me was, well, how did we get to this point, and what are the benefits of it? We got into employer-sponsored insurance in this country in World War II. And we got there basically from wage controls put into place. So for a company to get a more qualified worker, they'd have to offer a health care benefit. They'd have to offer, we'd have to offer a health care benefit so that they would come work for the company. The IRS sanctioned this with a tax-exempt status, and all of a sudden, employer-sponsored insurance became kind of the mantra of the land. Now, there are benefits to the system, and the benefits to the system are basically that, one, you have risk pooling. So with risk pooling, you take a bunch of employees, you got maybe 10 sicker ones and 990 healthy ones, and you can pool that risk across that entire set of employees so that the cost of the care for those 10 sick employees will get spread out amongst everyone. No one is hit too hard. The second benefit for the whole process was it allowed group purchasing. So if you have a large company, well then they could negotiate a better insurance rate with the insurance provider and get cheaper premiums for their employees. So these two things were benefits from the employer-sponsored insurance scheme that we've had up to this point. The problems we can see fairly clearly with Hobby Lobby when you have the religious freedom of the employer or the employee versus their health care rights. But the bigger problem in my mind is this whole issue of job lock. So job lock occurs when you don't want to leave your job for another opportunity or for retirement because health insurance is an issue.
Great. Hold that thought. We need to take a break so we can hear from our sponsors that make the show possible. Please stay tuned. We're coming right back. Welcome back to Pennsylvania Crossfire. Today we're discussing the Hobby Lobby verdict with three distinguished medical physicians from the Philadelphia market. I cut you off, Dr. Mehta, on the issue of job lock. So you were about to explain what job lock means.
So in job lock, you as an employee are using health insurance as a consideration on whether or not you'll stay with a company or not, or move to a different company. This is a situation where, and I think surveys show between 30 to 40% of employees use health insurance as a consideration, where a worker who's older may have chosen to retire earlier and maybe make room for a younger employee, maybe just graduated from college. These are instances where an employee may have left the company to start a new business, entrepreneur. And these are also instances where an employee of a large company may choose not to work for a smaller business or a smaller company that really doesn't have the same group purchasing oomph as a larger firm. So job lock to me is a big concern for employer-sponsored insurance, in addition to issues such as Hobby Lobby. And I think that is a reason to really think about why we have this in the first place. Why not separate the two out? The Affordable Care Act actually has interesting provisions that help get rid of job lock and get rid of employer-sponsored insurance. With the individual marketplace, you've created a marketplace where people can go independent of their employer and buy health insurance. With the medical loss ratio, you don't really need to have large group purchasing agreements, because insurance companies say that, well, the law says 80 cents of the dollar has to be used for medical care, and only 20 cents will be used for our shiny buildings and office spaces and profits. So I think that we have solutions that are coming out there. And my hope is that eventually we'll decouple employer-sponsored, well, employment and insurance.
Well, I happen to support the decoupling, if you will. As an employer of a medium-sized law firm, you know, it's both distracting and uncomfortable to have, frankly, almost any role in my employees' and team members' insurance. But you can't help but be sort of trapped and tied in as an employer, picking features that may or may not be suitable for each of the individuals. So what say you, Dr. Hunt?
Well, I think that, again, this is somewhat of an issue of making a mountain out of a molehill, this whole issue that's happened with the Hobby Lobby. Really what we're looking at is there's a historical basis, as he pointed out, after the war, of why we ended up with employer-sponsored health care. But the reality is 55 to 60% of Americans get their health insurance that way. And many of them, when you do the math, when you do the polling, they like their health insurance as it is. In fact, that was a big fight with the ACA coming in, was they didn't want to lose their old plan. Okay, so you have the reality of this is
You're going to get to keep your doctor and keep your plan.
That was what was claimed. So this is the boots on the ground, is that the majority of folks do get there. And in some ways it's somewhat American in the sense that people feel like, well, we're giving them a benefit, but it's because they're working, all right? And this also aligns the employer, and it has its roots in the notion, both of the Kaiser system with the way he was able to take care of his employees, was your employer should want you to be healthier so you can perform better at your work and everything else. And in fact, you see a lot of the innovation that's happening in medical delivery today in places like Google and Apple, where they actually pay their employees to lose weight, they give them incentives to quit smoking, and all of those things that maybe an employer doesn't want to do. Now, as to the Hobby Lobby decision itself, I disagree with it because I think that we've just been giving corporations more and more personhood, and this is just one more example of personhood. Now they apparently have religious rights, which, you know, I don't even get a lot of religious rights at home, at least my wife. So how is it that we're now giving corporations, you know, personhood to the point of them having religious rights? That to me is ridiculous. Now, I think that it's not only the fault of the owners of Hobby Lobby, because those folks obviously I will, you know, I'll just accept at face value that they really believed religiously, you know, deeply in their religion, and they wanted this because of the values that they hold. But I think that that's separate when you're a company, and I think that the government made a strong case for that. That when you're a company, you're separating out the religious side of it from the employment side of it. One of them is it has to do with healthcare, and as a famous person I like to quote said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God." And this is Caesar's. Okay, this is a matter of, this is a secular issue that relates to healthcare, and those things are just simply not in the purvey of a corporation to decide. Because if we start letting corporations decide what's a religious right, what right they religion, we're going to have the you know, Jehovah's Witnesses not letting us go get our blood transfusion when we're getting surgery, and we're going to have the, you know, so it just creates a huge mess out there. Now, they did, to their credit, the justices did try to restrict the ruling to say that this was because, you know, this was a corporation that was less than 5 people or whatever the owners were, and this and that. Namely, they tried to say, well, this is a special kind of personhood. A corporation that looks like this, that's a person, but a corporation that looks like that, that's not a person. Well, now I'm really confused. You know, how can you know, in the first place, I don't understand how a corporation could be a person. You know, a person is a person. I can shake their hands, and I can hold a person responsible when they kick me in the butt, you know? So I just feel that this whole thing was, it was the president trying to put his thumb in the eye of folks who are religious and hold a company, and I don't appreciate that. That's just purposely antagonistic. At the same time, I think that they've pushed this issue with the Hobby Lobby, and I think it's opened up a whole mess for us in the system. Now, in terms of do I believe in health insurance from the employers, absolutely, because again, I think that you are incentivized as an employer to make sure that your employees are engaging in healthful behaviors, and you can help them along. And remember that what's really happening in this country is that 45,000 Americans are dying from a lack of health insurance. And if you try to go ahead and come up with all these other mechanizations of how we're going to do away with employer-sponsored health care, you're going to end up with a whole lot more folks falling through the cracks and not getting medical care and dying by the wayside without access to care.
You've been awfully quiet this segment, Dr. Jha. What are your thoughts?
It's very hard to interrupt Dr. Hunt when he's in full flow. But I think that there is a certain boomerang in Dr. Hunt's arguments, which is that on one hand he says render unto Caesar what is unto Caesar, yet we're asking employers to carve benefit plans. It strikes me as the most natural and common sense thing to do is to actually remove them from that decision making altogether. If there can be any particular clash, and clearly this is a heterogeneous country with lots of opinions, lots of values, lots of different values, why ossify it, or why create a fight, why create opposition when one can avoid it? And I think that there is no doubt that if employer-sponsored insurance was not the predominant way of obtaining health insurance in this country, this type of antagonism would not be occurring, and it wouldn't make the world a nicer place. It wouldn't solve all our problems, but it would at least make us focus on some other problems. So this is a direct result of employer-sponsored insurance. Now the question is, what would happen if we put them into the exchanges? And that is, again, a very ironical argument. I don't think Dr. Hunt really believes that putting people into the exchanges is going to put them into this pool of 45,000 people that supposedly are dying every year because of lack of insurance. I think those numbers are possibly true, but as with all numbers, they have to be taken in context and with circumspection, because a great portion of the Affordable Care Act relies on the exchanges, and if one were to follow logically that the exchanges aren't doing anything, then why do they exist? Why don't we just simply have a Medicare for all? So
but Dr. Jha, are you arguing in favor of the ACA and the exchanges now? Is that your solution to the problem of employer-sponsored health care? You think that this ACA is going to solve the problem of employer-sponsored health care?
ACA won't, because ACA doesn't do anything against employer-sponsored insurance, but I do think that if you had a robust, free-for-all, across state line exchange that was regulated, heavily regulated in terms of the benefits that they should and
But you just said free-for-all and heavily regulated. How can you have a laissez-faire system that's heavily regulated? We had that. It's called the poorhouse. And guess what happened? We shut them all down because this country doesn't tolerate that kind of stuff.
What an unfortunate time to have to take a break. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back with more. Welcome back to Pennsylvania Crossfire. Today we're discussing the Hobby Lobby verdict, and we're going to pick back up with Dr. Jha because I don't think he can tolerate being accused of being supportive of the ACA. So let's at least give you a chance to respond to Dr. Hunt.
Well, firstly, any argument with Dr. Hunt ends up at some point in time about arguing about free will. So we need to really kind of marginalize the argument and say it has to stop there. What are we arguing about? I think the ACA has good bits, and the ACA has bits that are unreformed. I would use the word unreformed, not bad bits, unreformed. I do think that if you had and the word laissez-faire is not really applicable here, but nor is it contradictory with regulation, nor is it contradictory with government involvement, because that is essentially the laissez-faire system. Otherwise you have an anarchist system. What you want over here is you want a system where people are insured by mechanisms other than their employer. Because if you have people insured by the employer has asymmetric power over the person. Now, it's all well and dandy saying stuff like, well, they're interested in your health. Of course they're interested in your health, but to what extent should they be interested in your health? Should they know what I eat for dinner, what I eat for breakfast? I think one is creating one can potentially create a form of vigilance that could even be tyrannical if left alone. So the employers have to be put in their position. The employers have to be put in the position. Let's approach this common sense, which is to say that let insurers in the marketplace, with their minimum health benefits, with contracts with larger healthcare systems or ACOs or whatever they may be, operate across state lines. So what works in Texas ought to work in Philadelphia. But let's first and foremost leave employers out of this, because today we have Hobby Lobby, quite rightly, you're quite right there. Tomorrow we could have something else. I don't think Jehovah's Witness and the blood transfusion, I mean, that's just something ridiculous to make the argument sound more persuasive. But you're right, we could have something else. We don't know what we're going to have. Who knew we were going to have Hobby Lobby? And that will just create more tension, more polarization, more 5-4 decisions, and more angst and animosity, rather than sorting out things that are important for this country, such as economic growth and a sensible foreign policy.
Well, that's very interesting, because I think that as someone who's dealt with American insurance companies related to trying to fight with them over bills and stuff like that, I sure as heck like the fact that my employer was able to stand with me and the 10,000 other employees in the health system of the University of Pennsylvania to help me resolve the issue with my insurance company. But ask any folks who's out there on their own, little David against the big Goliath insurance company, how they fare. Let me tell you, they don't fare very well. That's why we have majority of bankruptcies associated with healthcare cost, because folks are out there and the insurance company can screw them any which way they want it to. That's why only 9% of the population is in that system, and the other 60% are over in the employer health care. The folks can opt out of their employer health care and go get the system, go get the exchange unto themselves. That's not what happens. They choose to stay with their employer because of all those benefits that he mentioned. The fact that you have collective bargaining, the fact that you've got Goliath on your side instead of slingshot and God. Okay, because that's kind of what we're ending up with. Is you're talking about let the poor guy go out there and fight Goliath by himself.
Well, there are 2 points I'd like to make. The first one is that you're glad that you had a large employer and you had a large business behind you to fight on your side. Well, what about the small business? What about the individual entrepreneur who really can't hire 10,000 employees? They have 2 or 3. What about them? They're going to be left behind in a system that benefits a larger employer over the smaller business. And the second point about, yes, 60% of people have employer-sponsored insurance and are very happy with it. Well, it's not the level playing field. You have one system that receives considerable tax advantage, and you don't have an alternative where they can get the same tax advantage and get the same price for the policy. So it's not a level playing field. You already have a stacked playing field where a larger business is going to have much more power than a smaller business. And we've created the system that way. Let's uncreate it. Let's reform it.
But Dr. Mehta, for the vast majority of Americans with a median income of $45,000, they're not getting their health insurance for a tax break. Maybe in your tax bracket they are. But the average Joe on the street, the average American, middle-class American who's going out there getting health insurance, they're getting health insurance so they can get some frickin' care from their doctor. Okay, that's why they get it. They don't get it for a tax break. So while that's a great argument, I think that even if you level the playing field and make a tax advantage to go get it in the individual payer system, you're not going to find a lot of folks leaving their employer health care system because there's too many other advantages to it.
No, I think Stephen, a couple of points over here. Firstly, it's not so much the tax advantage that is the issue over here. It is the fact that you have an asymmetry in the market, a ripple, a mismatch. When you have a mismatch, the one that is underpowered is not going to do as well that is overpowered. Now you talk about Goliath versus, you talk about the small man being the David versus a big insurance company being the Goliath. One of the reasons Goliath prevails over David is because Goliath is used to fighting Goliaths. You had Goliath on your side. Take the Goliaths away, and then all of a sudden, Davids will join together to form their own Goliath. So what I'm trying to point out to you here is that some of the very legitimate concerns you have over having rid of the employer-sponsored market may not occur if you got rid of them, just simply because people will join together, aggregate, and fight the Goliath. And so I think that you're not considering the alternative plausibility as much as you're considering the current state. It's as if everything will be constant the way it is right now, but it's not. History has shown us when you have policy change, things also change as well.
It's not a matter of numbers, Harry. The point is that no matter how many Davids you line up in a row, when they're in front of a howitzer, their numbers ain't going to matter. So now making every poor American get out there and band together, people. Be your own joint commission. That's why we created a USDA to inspect meat. That's why we created the Department of Health Services to oversee these things, because individually we're not able to get those rights.
Yet again, we could have gone on for hours on this topic. I'm so glad that you're with us today. I want to take this opportunity to thank our doctor panel, Dr. Hunt, Dr. Mehta, Dr. Jha, and especially thank our viewers at home for watching. Please be sure to tune in next week for another great edition of Pennsylvania Crossfire. This is Buddy Lesavoy for Pennsylvania Crossfire, hoping you have a great week.